The Case of the Vanished Organist, Inspector Purbright, BBC Mystery Audio. The evening began like many others in Flaxborough, still faintly damp and touched by that persistent sense of unimportant purpose that attends all small towns at 6 o'clock. The lamps along St. Olaf's Lane flickered into their amber bloom just as the first notes of the organ rose from the church, broad, confident, and slightly sentimental. The sound moved through the mist like breath on glass. Inside, the vicar stood by the chancel rail, grateful for the warmth of the pipes. Mr. Alan Bream, the organist, was never less than punctual and always faintly aloof, as though he performed not for the congregation, but for some inward audience only he could hear. His long fingers pressed the keys with precision, his head bowed just so, like a man listening for a distant echo. Halfway through Abide With Me, a strange thing happened. The music faltered. A single discord hung in the air, trembled and stopped. The silence that followed was not empty, but expectant, like a held breath in the wrong place. The vicar glanced up from his prayer book. Mr. Bream? There was no answer. The stool behind the console stood empty. The small mirror used to reflect the nave showed only the dim outline of the choir stalls. Somewhere beyond the vestry, a door creaked open and closed. By morning, the air had turned clear and brittle. The milk rounds began, the baker's van rattled over the cobbles, and Mrs. Fanshawe at the paper shop heard it first from the sexton. The organist's gone missing. Vanished, he has. Left his bicycle right there by the wall. Purbright heard of it only later, through the usual chain of mild astonishment that linked the town's ears. At his desk he opened a drawer, found his notebook, and considered the matter with the sort of detached curiosity reserved for small puzzles that might, with time, reveal large truths. By noon the bicycle had become something of a spectacle. Propped neatly against the north wall, its tires lightly flecked with mud, it looked both ordinary and theatrical, like a clue someone had left for show. The lamp was still attached, the chain oiled, the saddle adjusted to its tall owner's height. Purbright ran a hand over the handlebars. "Not theft, then," he murmured. "Nor haste." The vicar joined him, hat in hand, eyes troubled. "He didn't come home, Inspector. His rooms are untouched. His bed not slept in." Purbright nodded slowly. "Any enemies?" "None that I know, though perhaps sensitivities." He could be proud. Very proud. That word, proud, lingered in the air like incense. Purbright looked toward the grey windows of the church, where faint traces of the last hymn still seemed to hover. Pride, he thought, was a dangerous companion to loneliness, and in towns such as Flaxborough, loneliness could often play louder than any organ. He stood for a while longer, listening to the silence, until the bells of St. Olaf's clock marked the hour. The day began again, polite as ever, but beneath its civility, something had shifted. The calm had cracked. By the following afternoon, the mystery of the vanished organist had travelled faster than the milk vans. Flaxborough, for all its quiet manners, could never resist a disappearance. It lent the day a pleasing sense of importance. From the bakery queue to the post office counter, a hush would descend whenever someone mentioned Mr. Bream, followed by a delicate pause and then, inevitably, invention. At Mrs. Jessop's greengrocer's, a woman in a headscarf declared that she had always suspected he was the secretive sort. She claimed to have seen him once on the London train, though she could not remember when, or indeed whether it had been him at all. Mrs. Jessop, packing carrots into a paper bag, said nothing but managed to suggest through her silence that she had known far worse. The conversation continued over the steady thud of the till, voices rising and falling like the drone of a beehive. By tea-time, the organist's departure had acquired several shapes: elopement, breakdown, foreign travel, and, according to a young porter at the station, a government appointment in music censorship. The truth mattered less than the story itself. Inspector Purbright heard these fragments through the usual channels: Constable Chubb's cheerful reports, Miss Teatime's carefully phrased asides, and the general murmur that seeped through Flaxborough's lace-curtained windows. He did not yet call it an investigation. It was, for the moment, an exercise in listening. He walked along the high street, the air bright with shop-front reflections, the faint clang of the church bell marking 4. There was comfort in the pattern of sound, the rhythmic sweep of the pavement brush, the click of his shoes, and somewhere beyond, the echo of a piano tuner testing notes in an upstairs room. The town went on, outwardly unchanged, but there was that small vacancy. Like a missing chord, outside the post office, Mrs. Pooley leaned on her bicycle, her expression a mixture of curiosity and satisfaction. "Terrible business, Inspector." "I say left a note." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "I say many things, Mrs. Pooley." "Or the vicar's been pale as milk all day." "That must mean something. He wouldn't be so pale if it were nothing, would he?" "Paleness," Purbright said gently, "often means only that one has been surprised before breakfast." He smiled, tipped his hat, and continued down the street. At the library, the assistant mentioned that Mr. Bream had borrowed a volume of Mendelssohn's letters the week before and had not returned it. The thought seemed to trouble her, not the loss of the book, but its sudden incompleteness on the shelf. "He was always quiet," she said, "but polite. You felt he might speak if only you waited long enough." In the police office, Purbright stood by the window, the late light falling across his desk in long, pale strips. He wrote 2 words in his notebook: pride, loneliness. Then he closed it again. Outside, the wind stirred the paper pinned to the notice board, the week's schedule for Evensong, a jumble sale, a missing cat. The organist's name was not among them, but his absence hung in the air nonetheless, a small, unsettled thing, as dusk gathered. Purbright walked once more toward St. Olaf's. The church loomed in silhouette against the thinning mist, its windows dark, its tower outlined by a faint shimmer of rain. The bicycle had been moved indoors. The door creaked open at his touch, releasing the scent of polish and candle wax. Inside, the nave was empty. Only the faint tick of the heating pipes disturbed the hush. Purbright stood by the organ, tracing a finger along the row of stops. One bore a smear of dust, as though brushed by an unsteady hand. Another gleamed as if recently cleaned. The stool was neatly pushed in, but the cushion bore a faint impression, still visible in the low light. He heard the soft pad of footsteps and turned. The vicar emerged from the vestry, looking worn but composed. "You'll forgive me, Inspector." "I didn't expect company, nor did I," Purbright replied. "You've been much asked about today," the vicar sighed, folding his hands. "Yes, I suppose we must expect it. People dislike an absence. They rush to fill it. Have you filled yours?" A faint smile touched the vicar's lips. "Faith forbids it. I prefer to wait." Purbright nodded, allowing the silence to extend, as though the air itself might choose to speak. At last he said, "Did he strike you as a man who would leave quietly?" "Quietly, yes. But not without reason." "He was troubled, perhaps?" "Not by sin, but by something gentler. Regret, maybe. Regret of what sort?" The vicar hesitated, gaze drifting toward the choir stalls. "He once told me," he said slowly, "that music can make a man too aware of the distance between what is and what might have been." "I didn't understand him then." Purbright looked again at the silent console, the blank mirror reflecting only shadows. "No," he murmured, "but perhaps we shall." Outside, rain had begun to fall in a fine, unhurried drizzle, whispering against the windows like soft applause. As Purbright stepped back into the night, he paused beneath the church lantern and drew a slow breath. The air smelled faintly of wet stone and something else, something elusive, like the echo of a note not yet played. Flaxborough would be talking still, he thought. Through windows, over teacups, into the telephone receiver held just a moment too long. They would make of Mr. Bream what they needed him to be: tragic, romantic, absurd, or wicked. Each would compose a version to suit their comfort. He walked home without hurry, the drizzle brushing his coat, the lamps haloed in mist. Behind him, the church stood dark once more, holding its secrets with the patient discretion of old walls. And somewhere, in the folds of that quiet town, the first faint chord of truth was beginning to sound, too soft to name, but unmistakably there. Morning drew itself thinly across the rooftops, a pale wash of sun that offered light, but no warmth. The mist had lifted, yet the air still seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for someone to speak a truth they'd been rehearsing overnight. Inspector Purbright left the station without haste, his hat tilted against a faint wind that carried the faint smell of damp hymn books and coal smoke. He had told Sergeant Love he was off to stretch his legs, a phrase which in Flaxborough had come to mean an enquiry of the quietest kind. At St. Olaf's, the churchyard lay in that deceptive calm peculiar to English mornings after small scandals. Dew beaded the grass, and the stones gleamed faintly, names half lost to the weather. Beyond the lich gate, a robin flicked from perch to perch, as if pacing the perimeter of decency. Purbright paused beside the bicycle, now sheltered under the porch, and examined it again. The tyres were clean, which meant it had not been ridden far. A faint rust speckled the spokes where the morning damp had settled. He noted these small domestic signs, not for what they proved, but for what they failed to explain. The bicycle's patience was almost human. Inside, the vicar was arranging hymnals, stacking them with the reverent care of a man unsure what to do with his hands. When he saw Purbright, he smiled, a brief, dutiful thing that never reached his eyes. "Inspector," he said, "you've come early. There's no news, I'm afraid." "News rarely keeps good hours," Purbright replied.
"I thought I'd pay my respects to absence."
"It seems to have settled here." The vicar allowed a short, rueful laugh. "Yes, I fear we shall have to grow accustomed to it." They moved together through the nave, the echo of their steps mingling with the creak of the pews. The stained glass caught what little light there was, laying soft colours across the stone. "Tell me," Purbright said, "when did you last see him?" "Sunday evening."
"After Evensong."
He seemed well enough. A little distracted, perhaps. But that was not unusual. Distracted how? Not kindly so. He had a habit of listening inwardly as though a melody were still playing somewhere beyond our hearing. Purbright nodded. "A man who keeps company with silence." "Yes," the vicar said, closing a hymn book. "And perhaps silence kept him." They stood for a moment, the air filled with the faint rustle of pages and the slow ticking of the church clock. Purbright's eyes moved to the organ, its pipes rising like sentinels of brass and shadow. He was fond of the instrument. Fond, he loved it. It was the one thing that answered him. Purbright stepped closer, his hand brushing a thin film of dust from the keys. "Did anyone else play?"
"No, he guarded it, though not unreasonably."
He said others muddied the phrasing. A perfectionist sin. The inspector's gaze lingered on the stool. Perfection, in my experience, often collapses under the weight of its own reflection. The vicar looked away.
"He did have
disappointments. Professional?
Personal, I think."
He was not married, but he had once been close to someone. She moved away, years ago. He never mentioned her name. Purbright filed the pause that followed, the slight stiffening of the vicar's shoulders, as carefully as any piece of evidence. "And no one else?" "No, how shall I put it? Unexpected correspondences." The vicar hesitated. He received letters, of course. Musicians must, for engagements.
"I cannot say more than that. Would you mind if I looked at his rooms?" "I thought you might ask," said the vicar quietly.
"The key is with Mrs. Bream, his landlady. She lives on Willow Row. She's not his relation, despite the name." "That, too, has caused talk." Purbright smiled faintly. "In Flaxborough, even coincidence is impolite." He left the church as the bells struck 9. The sound rolled over the rooftops, spreading like ripples across a pond. As he crossed the square, he caught fragments of conversation through open windows. One voice wondering about London, another about suicide, another about scandal. The stories were multiplying like ivy, feeding on absence. Willow Row was a narrow street of brick cottages, each with its own stoop of stubborn geraniums. Mrs. Bream answered his knock with the air of one both flattered and inconvenienced by official attention. Mr. Bream's room, Inspector?
Yes, of course. Poor man.
He paid on time, never troubled me, though he did keep odd hours. Music does that, I suppose. The staircase creaked as she led him up. The smell of polish mingled with last night's boiled cabbage, and a clock somewhere ticked with determined self-importance. The organist's room was small, almost monastic. A bed neatly made, a desk with a half-burned candle, a wardrobe whose door stuck halfway open. On the desk lay a stack of sheet music, and beside it, an empty teacup. The faint scent of pipe tobacco still clung to the curtains. Purbright stood at the window. From here, the view was of rooftops and the distant line of trees by the river. It was a view that seemed to encourage thought rather than comfort. Did he have visitors? Never that I saw. A quiet man. Sometimes the vicar came by, or that lady from the choir, the one with the red hat. Mrs. Larch? Yes, that's her. She said he helped her with her singing.
I dare say that's all it was, I dare say, said Purbright. When Mrs. Bream had gone, he opened the drawer of the desk.
Inside were a few coins, a pencil, and a folded note. He read only the first line before stopping. There are departures that have nothing to do with travel. The rest was smudged as if damp had softened the ink. He replaced it carefully. Whatever this was, it spoke not of flight, but of farewell. Downstairs, Mrs. Bream waited, her hands busy with a cloth she did not need. Will there be trouble, Inspector? Trouble? He said gently.
No, I shouldn't think so. Only questions.
And questions are rarely fatal. She gave a small, nervous laugh.
I hope not.
Flaxborough's not used to such things. Purbright thanked her and stepped back into the street. The morning had brightened, but the air still held its chill. Across the way, a milk cart rattled by, the driver whistling, "Jesu, joy of man's desiring." It was slightly out of tune. As Purbright walked toward the station, he felt the beginnings of a pattern forming, not yet clear, but insistent. The organist's life, like his music, had been composed in quiet keys, pride, solitude, secrecy. Yet beneath those chords there was something unresolved, something that trembled just out of reach. He would listen for it, he decided, not in what people said, but in what they hurried past, the small hesitations and swallowed words that told the truer story. The town was talking still, and he would let it. Talk was the dust of truth. When it settled, the shape beneath would reveal itself. For now he walked on, the steady rhythm of his steps joining the distant toll of the church bell. 2 measured sounds in an uncertain morning. By the end of the week, the matter of the vanished organist had been conveniently resolved by everyone except Inspector Purbright. In the shops, in the tea-rooms, in the faintly echoing aisles of St. Olaf's, the citizens of Flaxborough had agreed upon a story that suited their temper and tidied their discomfort. It was, by all accounts, a midlife adventure. Mr. Bream, wearied by provincial drudgery, had taken a notion to seek music and romance elsewhere. Some said Lincoln, others ventured as far as York. 1 or 2, drunk on imagination, whispered of London. The weather had favoured such invention, a grey drizzle, a sense of unfinished sentences in the air. Miss Teatime, who had a knack for turning rumour into prose, declared to a circle of eager listeners at the confectioner's that the whole thing was a case of romantic folly. She said it with a gleam that suggested she had once, perhaps twice, known the feeling herself. The poor man, she went on, selecting a peppermint cream, was doubtless smitten. Such men often are, and with the wrong sort of woman, one with opinions, the group murmured approvingly. Mr. Hopgood, the chemist, nodded gravely. He left a letter, I hear, to a lady in Lincoln. Something about unfulfilled promise. Tragic, but rather poetic. Purbright, who happened to be in the shop at the time, ostensibly for a bottle of liniment, though in truth for observation, said mildly,
"And who heard of this letter first, Mr. Hopgood?"
Miss Pooley, of course. She has a niece on the railway, indeed. Then the post must be running remarkably promptly. There was a polite chuckle, and the matter was allowed to dissolve in the pleasant rustle of paper bags. Purbright thanked them, paid for his non-existent liniment, and stepped back into the drizzle. The streets gleamed like pewter, and the lamps had already begun their evening flicker. Somewhere distant, a train gave its mournful cry, a coincidence so theatrical that even Purbright smiled. He knew how small towns built their myths, with fragments of truth, a little sentiment, and a good deal of relief. A vanished man was troubling. A man in love was merely interesting. At the police station, Sergeant Love was at his desk, brow furrowed over a crossword. 7 across, he said without looking up. 5 letters.
Means foolish infatuation. Any ideas, sir?
Purbright removed his hat and shook off the rain. Try flame, Sergeant, Love penciled it in, frowning. Seems too short-lived for what they're all saying. Most flames are, said Purbright. He hung his coat, then took from his pocket the folded note found in Bream's room. It had been sent to the lab in Lincoln, but the experts had returned it with a shrug. The ink was too smudged, the paper too common. Only the first line remained legible. There are departures that have nothing to do with travel. He read it again, aloud this time, letting the words settle in the room.
Love looked up.
You think he wrote that, sir? I think he meant it, Purbright said softly. Outside, the town clock struck 6, each chime wrapped in the damp hush of rain. Purbright gazed through the window where reflections of gaslight trembled like thought. The neat theory midlife crisis letter train fit too easily. It was clean, convenient, and left the living untroubled. But beneath it he felt a quieter note, one that refused resolution. The next morning brought a small flourish of finality. The vicar, encouraged by consensus, announced from the pulpit that Mr. Bream had sought new pastures and that we must wish him peace wherever his music leads. The congregation murmured assent, grateful for closure. Purbright sat at the back, hat in hand, watching faces turn briefly solemn before brightening again at the prospect of tea. The vicar's words drifted upward like incense, reassuring, faintly hollow. When the organ began its postlude, played hesitantly by a substitute from the next parish, the melody wavered, missed a note, and carried on. The error made several parishioners wince, but Purbright smiled faintly. Imperfection, he thought, was often the more honest register. After the service he lingered outside, watching the congregation disperse under a low sky. Miss Teatime approached, gloved and brisk, the scent of lavender and purpose about her. Inspector, you must admit it's all rather touching, don't you think?
A man alone taking the night train for love?
I find it terribly English. Terribly, Purbright agreed. She peered at him, sensing reluctance. You don't believe it?
Oh, I believe everything, Miss Teatime. It saves argument. Her eyes sparkled.
And yet I suspect you prefer mysteries that stay untidy. Untidiness, he said, is where the truth usually hides. Dust has its virtues, she laughed, her breath misting in the chill air, then drifted away like a particularly fragrant rumour. Purbright stood a moment longer, hands in pockets, the sound of the substitute organist's faltering notes leaking faintly from the church door. The tune was meant to be "Led kindly light," but the phrasing limped. He imagined Bream's reaction, a wince, a sigh, and perhaps a gentle correction, pride softened by affection. The inspector walked slowly back toward the station, his thoughts as measured as his steps. A neat explanation had been laid before the town like a well-pressed cloth, yet something in the pattern resisted smoothness. The smudged letter, the untouched bicycle, the vicar's uneasy phrasing. In the window of a draper's shop, a mannequin in a faded frock stood stiffly in the lamplight. For a moment, it seemed to him that Flaxborough itself resembled that figure, decorous, composed, and hollow at the centre. At his desk, he made a single note in his book. Truth postponed by comfort. Then, closing it, he allowed himself a small sigh. If Mr. Bream had indeed left for love, Purbright thought, it was not the sort that travelled by train. The clock ticked on, steady and unbothered. Outside, the rain thickened, drawing soft curtains across the town, and Flaxborough, satisfied with its story, settled once more into its well-behaved quiet. The following Tuesday brought a faint tremor of change to the air. Rain had washed the streets to a pale shine, and the smell of damp plaster and coal dust gave the town its particular weekday flavour. In Purbright's office, a visitor sat waiting, an elderly man with a case of tools and a manner both apologetic and opinionated. "Mr. Cattermole," he announced himself, "organ tuner. Been coming to St. Olaf's twice a year since before the war. Shame about Mr. Bream. Fine ear, if a bit of a temper when it came to tuning." Purbright regarded him with polite interest. "You knew him well?" "Well enough to be shouted at," Cattermole said, setting his case carefully on the floor. He had notions about how things ought to sound. Said I flattened his dulciana, though I'd swear it was his touch, not my pitch. Musical disagreement, then? Cattermole gave a small grunt. "Oh, more than that. He accused me of damaging one of his stop keys, a wooden slider on the great manual. Claimed I'd splintered it. I told him it was wear. He said wear didn't happen overnight. We left it at that, but he was fit to burst. Pride, that's what it was. Organists are proud creatures, Inspector." "Pride in their pipes?" Purbright smiled faintly. "So I gather." The tuner leaned forward, lowering his voice as though the pipes themselves might overhear. There was more, though. 2 days before he vanished, I came in for a final check. He was there, pale as chalk, muttering. I asked if something was wrong, and he said, "There's always something wrong if you listen long enough." Never forgot that. Did he mention anyone by name? Only said some people should keep their hands off the instrument. I took that to mean the choir boys, but, well, his tone was sharper than that. When the man had gone, Purbright stood at the window for a long moment, watching the light tremble over the cobbles.
"Pride in their pipes," he murmured.
The phrase lingered, oddly musical. By late afternoon he found himself walking once more through the quiet arch of St. Olaf's. The door groaned softly as he pushed it open.
Inside, the air smelled of stone and dust and the faint tang of polish.
The organ loomed at the far end, its great pipes catching what little light filtered through the stained glass. From behind the pews came the shuffle of small shoes and a half-whispered tune. A choir boy, no more than 12, stood on a stool polishing the candlesticks. He turned with the cautious curiosity of youth. "Afternoon," Purbright said mildly.
"You sing here?"
"Yes, sir. Trebles." "Ah, then you'll have known Mr. Bream." The boy nodded, his eyes bright. "He made us stay late if we missed our entries. Said music was a kind of manners." "That sounds like him," Purbright said.
"Do you ever see him angry?"
The boy hesitated, the cloth pausing mid-wipe. "Only once. In the vestry. He and Mr. Felby were shouting." "Mr. Felby being?" "The verger, sir. He keeps the keys. Mr. Bream said something about a drawer being opened. Mr. Felby said he'd never touch it."
"And Mr. Bream said that was a lie, even for Sunday." Purbright felt the stillness draw tight between them.
"Did anyone else hear?"
"I think Miss Larch did."
"She was sorting hymn sheets. Afterwards she told us to keep quiet about it. Did you?" The boy looked down at the brass candlestick. "Mostly." Purbright thanked him and let him return to his work. As he left the church, the wind caught the door and made it sigh on its hinges, a sound like tired resignation. That evening, in the low amber light of his office, Purbright examined his notes. Each scrap seemed to tug at another, the tuner, the quarrel, the unexplained draw. It was not much, yet it began to hum faintly with coherence, as though invisible strings connected them. He sent Sergeant Love to fetch Mr. Felby. The verger arrived with the damp smell of cellar air clinging to his coat. He stood respectfully, cap in hand, eyes darting like a man accused of nothing but expecting to be. "Mr. Felby," Purbright began, "I gather you had words with Mr. Bream not long before he disappeared." The man shifted his weight. "A difference of opinion, sir? About access to the vestry cupboard. He kept his music there and the key. Thought I'd been meddling. Had you?" "Only dusting, sir."
He said someone had moved a folder. I hadn't touched it. He was well on edge. Do you know why?
Felby hesitated. He'd had a letter that morning.
I saw it on the desk.
Blue envelope, Lincoln postmark. He read it, went pale as if the words had burned him. Purbright sat back. "You're certain?" "Yes, sir." He tore it up. I swept the pieces later. "Just paper. Nothing readable?" For a long moment neither spoke. The ticking of the clock filled the silence. Then Purbright said, "Thank you, Mr. Felby. You've been most helpful."
One last thing. Did Mr. Bream ever speak kindly of anyone?
The verger blinked. "Kindly, sir?"
Can't say he did.
But once when Miss Larch sang solo for the harvest service, he said she'd nearly found the note she was looking for. He smiled too. That was rare. When the man had gone, Purbright remained seated, listening to the quiet murmur of the town beyond the window. The blue envelope, the quarrel, the broken stop key, they formed no picture yet, only threads stretching into shadow. But he could feel them tightening, drawing toward something small, precise, and human. He poured himself a cup of tepid tea and stood by the map pinned to the wall. The light from the desk lamp fell in soft circles, gilding the edges of the paper. He thought again of Bream's words to the tuner. "There's always something wrong if you listen long enough." Purbright smiled faintly. "And always something right, if you listen carefully enough," he murmured. Outside, the wind lifted the leaves along the pavement, setting them rustling like scattered music. Somewhere in the distance, a train called through the mist, an echo perhaps of the story Flaxborough had already decided to believe. But Purbright, standing alone in the small office, heard a subtler refrain beneath it. The sound of pride bruised, of silence struck wrong, and of truth beginning, very quietly, to tune itself. By Thursday, the rain had settled into the kind of steady drizzle that did not so much fall as occupy the air. Flaxborough wore it without complaint, its streets darkened to a quiet gleam, the windows steamed and blurred like half-remembered thoughts. Purbright walked through the square, umbrella folded despite the weather, as though to feel the damp might help him think. At the post office, Mrs. Pooley was sorting letters with unusual delicacy, as if each envelope contained a confession. She brightened when she saw him. "Inspector, you'll be pleased to hear some correspondence has turned up." "From Mr. Bream's rooms, I gather." Purbright inclined his head. "Indeed." She lowered her voice as though the very stamps might be listening. 3 of them, all addressed to a Mrs. Warden. Lincoln postmark. The vicar brought them in, said they'd been tucked behind a drawer. Couldn't think what else to do but hand them over. Terrible handwriting. Musical people, I suppose. "Ah, yes," Purbright said. "They write by ear." She gave a polite laugh and handed him the small bundle, tied with pink string. The envelopes were pale blue, edges slightly curled, the ink blurred by what might have been damp, or tears, if one were of sentimental persuasion. He thanked her, signed the register, and left. The drizzle had thickened to a fine mist by the time he reached the vicarage. Inside, the vicar sat by the fire, spectacles in hand, a book unopened beside him. He looked up with the weary guilt of a man who had already imagined being questioned. "I trust you don't think me careless, Inspector," he began. "I'd no idea the letters were there until the drawer stuck. I was looking for hymn paper." Purbright set his umbrella in the stand. Accidents of conscience, like accidents of drawers, are often revealing. The vicar managed a faint smile. "They appear to be from Mrs. Warden. A widow lives on the edge of Lincoln. She and Mr. Bream had known each other years ago. She lost her husband during the war." "Did he speak of her?" "Rarely. Once, perhaps twice. Said she had an ear for kindness, whatever that may mean." Purbright considered the phrase. Possibly something musical, possibly not. He untied the string, withdrew one letter, and glanced down the page. The writing, though tremulous, bore the even rhythm of affection long rehearsed. "My dear Alan," it began, "your silence troubles me. I thought your playing might have softened since we last met, but perhaps I mistook tenderness for fatigue. Come if you can. There is more left to say than I once dared hope." Purbright folded it again, sliding it back. "No mention of travel, I see?" "No," the vicar admitted. "Only of sentiment. But sentiment is a dangerous traveller, Inspector. It tends to wander where it shouldn't." Later that afternoon, Purbright walked to the edge of town, where the houses thinned and the fields opened toward the low horizon. The widow, Mrs. Warden, had not yet answered his telegram, but another widow awaited, Mrs. Lovell, who had sung contralto in the St. Olaf's choir for nearly 20 years, and who possessed, by local reputation, the sharpest ear and the kindest smile in equal measure. Her house smelled of lavender and furniture polish. She met him at the door, wiping flour from her hands. "Inspector Purbright, do come in. I've been expecting you, though I can't say why. Tea?" "Thank you," he said, removing his hat. "Perhaps later. I was told you and Mr. Bream were friendly." She hesitated. "Friendly, yes, but not what they're saying. We shared an understanding, perhaps. Music is intimate that way. You breathe together, and people think it's love. Was it?" She poured the tea anyway, her hand steady. "It might have been once, but Alan didn't belong to anyone. He belonged to whatever was just out of reach. That's what made him beautiful. And impossible." Purbright watched the steam rise from the cup. "Did he ever confide in you?" "Once." She looked into the middle distance. "He told me he'd written to a woman years ago, someone from Lincoln. He'd said something cruel, and she'd never forgiven him. He wanted to, forgive himself, I mean. And did he?" Her mouth curved, not quite a smile. "Men like him never do. They just write better hymns." Purbright rose, taking a slow turn about the room. The piano stood open, a hymn book propped against its stand. A sheet of music lay beside it, in Paradisum. The same title found in the river reeds. "Did you lend him this?" he asked quietly. "No, he left it here. Said it was a reminder, to finish what he'd begun." Outside, dusk had gathered. The lamps came on with their soft electrical sigh. As Purbright walked back through the square, the rain eased, leaving the cobblestones slick and glistening. The sound of his shoes echoed faintly between the shop fronts, each step a small punctuation in the silence. At the station, Sergeant Love looked up from his typewriter. "Telegram for you, sir. From Lincoln." Purbright tore it open. The widow, Mrs. Warden's reply was brief. "Yes, I knew him. Yes," he wrote. "No, he did not come." He folded it, slipped it into his pocket, and said nothing for a moment. The clock above the mantel ticked patiently. "Funny thing, sir," Love went on. The papers up north have a small notice. A body pulled from the river near Saxelby last night. Middle-aged man. No identification. They say it might have been there some days." Purbright's eyes moved toward the window. The night pressed softly against the glass like breath. "Might, Sergeant," he said. "A useful word. It saves people from having to think." Love nodded awkwardly. "Should I ring them?" "Not yet. Let them have their certainties a little longer." When the sergeant had gone, Purbright sat alone, listening to the low hum of the radiator. On his desk lay the open letter, Mrs. Warden's plea for a meeting never kept. The ink had faded at the edges, as if the words themselves had grown tired of waiting. He imagined the organist, Alan Bream, seated once more at his console, hands poised above the keys, a note half-formed. Around him, all the polite silences of Flaxborough, holding their breath. Pride bruised by longing, affection soured by restraint, and he thought how easily people mistook harmony for peace, when often it was only tension made bearable. He closed the letter carefully, placed it atop the others, and extinguished the lamp. The office darkened to shadow, and the faint hiss of rain began again outside, steady and small. In that sound, soft, persistent, unresolved, Purbright thought he could almost hear the missing man's last refrain. Not a cry for help, but a final chord, drawn out just long enough to fade. The rain had thickened by morning, not the mild drizzle Flaxborough tolerated, but a full, deliberate downpour that blurred the view from every window. Gutters overflowed, cobbles glistened black, and even the pigeons beneath the station eaves looked indignant. The town had folded itself inward, resigned to dampness and waiting. Purbright stood by his office window, watching the water stream down the glass like an impatient thought. The sky pressed low and colourless. On his desk, Mrs. Warden's letter lay beside the telegram from Lincoln, two small relics of unfinished feeling. He tapped a finger against them, then reached for his hat. "I'll be at St. Olaf's," he told Sergeant Love. The walk was slow and wet, his coat already heavy by the time he reached the churchyard. The ground squelched beneath his shoes. The graves had turned to shallow islands in a sea of brown water. Beyond the railings the river had risen, a dull, restless presence lapping at the edges of the path. Two figures waited near the bridge, Constable Chubb and a fisherman in a dripping cap. Between them lay a sodden shape, caught among the reeds. The constable lifted his hand in greeting, unnecessary in the silence. "Found it this morning, sir," he said. "Snagged under the east bank. Thought at first it was rubbish, but it's stitched at the top, like a sack." Purbright crouched, rain trickling from his hat brim. "And inside?" Chubb hesitated. "Paper, sir. Lots of it. Music sheets, by the look." "Music?" "Yes, sir. All ruined. Inks run like blood." The fisherman crossed himself without ceremony. "Best get it away from the river. It's not right seeing something like that float up." Together they hauled the sodden sack onto the path. It sagged and tore slightly at the seam, releasing a sour, wet smell of decay and paper. Purbright knelt, pulling one sheet gently free. The notes had dissolved into grey blurs, the staves faint ghosts of their former order. One corner, miraculously intact, bore a single, legible title, In Paradisum. He looked at it for a long moment, rain ticking softly against his hat. Then he folded the sheet, slipped it into his pocket, and rose. "At least," he said quietly, "the river has good taste." Back inside the church, the air was colder than usual, heavy with the scent of wet stone. The organ stood silent, its pipes beaded with condensation. The vicar waited near the vestry, hands clasped, face pale. They say the river's broken the lower meadow, he murmured. The churchyard will flood by nightfall. Purbright nodded, glancing toward the nave. Water finds what secrets neglect leaves behind. Did you know the piece in Paradisum? The vicar blinked. Yes, it's a requiem passage. May the angels lead you into paradise. It was one of his favourites. Fitting, Purbright said. The river returned it to us. The vicar's mouth tightened. You think it's connected? That he... I think, Purbright interrupted gently, that the world has a taste for symbols, just as small towns have for tidy endings. But no, I don't think he drowned. Not yet, at least. A gust of rain rattled against the windows. Somewhere in the tower, a bell shifted on its rope and gave a low, uncertain note. Purbright moved to the organ, brushing his fingers across the damp keys. Tell me, when you play this instrument, do you ever hear what isn't there? The vicar frowned. I don't understand. Echoes, perhaps. The residue of someone else's performance. Sometimes. Why? Purbright turned, his expression unreadable. Because this morning, down by the river, I found the echo of a man who wanted to be heard once more. The vicar said nothing. The rain filled the pause. That afternoon, Purbright sent the papers to be dried and examined, though he doubted they would yield much. Still, the gesture mattered. Investigation, like faith, depended on persistence. When he returned to the station, Sergeant Love looked up from a damp pile of reports. Anything in it, sir? Only music, Purbright said, and something that used to resemble hope. Love hesitated, then ventured. Could the sack have come from the church, sir? Some kind of clearing out? Unlikely. Too deliberate. Someone wanted the river to have it, or to seem that way. He placed the folded sheet on the desk blotter. The ink had begun to dry in strange patterns, the notes now like fingerprints smudged by time. Do you ever notice, he said after a while, how grief and guilt share a handwriting? Love blinked, uncertain. Can't say I've looked, sir. Then start, Purbright murmured. We may be reading one disguised as the other. Evening fell early, pressing its blue gloom against the windows. The street lamps hummed softly, their reflections trembling in the puddles. Purbright sat alone, the faint sound of dripping gutters marking the silence between thoughts. He reached again for the letter from Mrs. Warden. There is more left to say than I once dared hope. The words felt heavier now, as if weighted by the river's gift. He imagined Alan Bream writing late into the night, the organ silent, the lamp casting a small circle of defiance against the dark, a man who had measured his life in harmonies and found dissonance instead, a man who could not bear to hear what he had broken. The church bell sounded 8, dull and imperfect, as though tired of its duty. Purbright rose, closed his notebook, and glanced toward the window where the rain had begun again, steady and unrelenting. Outside, the water would be rising still, creeping through the graves, dissolving names, carrying fragments of the past toward the sea. And somewhere beneath that quiet, persistent flow, the truth waited, submerged perhaps, but not lost. He turned down the lamp, the office dimming to a warm shadow, and in the hush that followed, it seemed to him that he could almost hear it, a faint, uncertain chord rising from the dark, seeking its resolution. The following morning arrived pale and muffled, as if the town had been wrapped overnight in damp wool. The rain had finally relented, leaving the pavement slick and shining like slate. Purbright walked through the square with his hands clasped behind his back, his pace unhurried, his thoughts not quite at rest. The sack of ruined music still lingered in his mind, not as evidence, but as symbol, something discarded, then returned, demanding to be noticed. He began his quiet round of visits, not formal calls, merely the sort of appearances Flaxborough understood as polite curiosity. A question over tea, a pause by a mantelpiece, a glance that invited recollection. The dead, or the missing, have a way of drawing confessions without ever asking. Mrs. Larch received him first. Her parlour smelled faintly of furniture polish and violets, the air thick with the effort of composure. She wore black, though no one had died. Her fingers twisted a handkerchief she did not seem to need. "I can't imagine what more there is to say, Inspector," she began, eyes fixed on the fire. Mr. Bream was distant. Musical people often are. They live half in their own heads. "And half in ours sometimes," Purbright said gently. She looked up, startled by the accuracy of it. Perhaps.
He did have a way of making one feel visible, only for a moment, but, well, it's an unsettling kindness. Was it kindness?
She smiled, a small, self-correcting thing. "I prefer to think so. He never said anything improper."
But he could make silence feel
personal. Purbright inclined his head.
A dangerous gift.
"Did you see him before he vanished?" "The Thursday before. He came to return a book of hymns."
"I offered him tea."
"He refused, said he was late for an appointment. Then he hesitated, as though he'd forgotten where he was meant to go." "And did he remember?" She hesitated too long. "I think so," he said. "Somewhere I ought to have been years ago." I didn't understand. Purbright thanked her and rose. She followed him to the door, her composure wavering.
"Inspector," she said quietly, if something has happened, please don't let them say it was despair."
He wasn't that sort of man. Purbright turned his hat in his hands.
"No," he said softly.
Despair is far too final for men who live on unfinished notes. Outside, the light had sharpened slightly, the sun pushing through thin veils of mist. The church tower glistened faintly, and somewhere a hammer rang from a distant workshop. His next call took him to the home of Mr. Felby, the verger, whose modest cottage stood opposite the cemetery gates. The man was oiling a door hinge when Purbright arrived, his expression caught between deference and fatigue. "Morning, sir," he said. "Can't say I've much to add since last time." "The vicar's already told you about the letters." "He has," Purbright replied. "I wondered if you'd seen any of their contents before they disappeared into the drawer." Felby hesitated, the hinge squeaking faintly in the pause. "Only once, a word or two."
"Forgive me," that was one.
"Yours ever," another. "That sort of thing. Not unpleasant words." "Depends who's saying them." Purbright gave a small smile.
"And to whom?" Felby grunted, setting down the oil can.
"He wasn't cruel exactly, but he made you feel small. Not by words, but by being contained. Like he knew you wouldn't understand his world, and he didn't intend to explain." "That sort of distance," Purbright said, "can feel like injury." "Aye," Felby muttered. "To some more than others." When Purbright left, the air had grown heavy again, clouds gathering like unspoken thoughts. He crossed the bridge, stopping where the reeds had bent under the river's recent rise. The spot where the sack had been found was quiet now, only the slow swirl of muddy water against the bank. He lingered, then turned toward the edge of town where Mrs. Lovell's lane began. The widow was in her garden, pruning roses with brisk efficiency. She greeted him with a warmth that did not quite reach her eyes. "Inspector, you'll forgive the state of things. Nothing dries properly this week. Nothing seems to," he said.
"Except rumours." She smiled faintly, snipping a stem.
"They do like to keep busy, don't they?"
"I suppose you're here about Alan." "I'm here about the absence of Alan," Purbright replied. "Absence leaves its own shape, I find." She laid the shears aside.
"He was a kind man, in his way, but I think he lived always a half step away from kindness. Like someone who means to embrace you, but remembers too late that he shouldn't." "That's an eloquent caution," Purbright said. "Did he ever speak of leaving?" "Once. He said he'd grown tired of being reliable. I told him that's what respect means, being relied upon. He said, 'Then perhaps I'd rather be forgiven.'" Purbright considered this, watching her wipe her hands on her apron. "And did you forgive him, Mrs. Lovell?" Her eyes flickered. "For what, Inspector?" "For whatever he never quite said." A long silence followed. The wind moved through the wet leaves, whispering like someone remembering too late. She sighed at last. He borrowed things. Songs, feelings, bits of other people's lives. He returned some, not all.
I expect that's the debt that keeps him from peace. When he left her garden, the first fine drops of rain were falling again, soft and insistent.
He walked slowly toward the church, where the air smelled of damp stone and the faint sweetness of polish. Inside, a woman was lighting candles near the altar, Miss Tea Time, as composed as ever, her movements delicate and deliberate. "I thought I'd find you here," she said, without looking up. "You have the expression of a man haunted not by ghosts but by manners," Purbright smiled faintly. In Flaxborough, the two are often related. She struck another match, its flame momentarily bright. "So, our poor organist, any nearer to your peace of mind?" "Not peace," he said, "only pattern. Everyone claims not to have known him well, and yet every word they speak rings like affection trying not to sound like guilt." Miss Tea Time blew out the match.
"Ah, the most English emotion of all." Purbright glanced toward the silent organ, its polished keys reflecting the candlelight.
"He seems to have composed his life in minor chords," he said.
"And everyone else provided the harmony, quietly, unwillingly, and much too late." She smiled, almost kindly.
"Perhaps that's the price of being admired, Inspector. To be remembered by those you never truly touched." Purbright's gaze lingered on the organ one last time. "Yes," he murmured, "and to leave behind a tune no one dares finish." He left the church, his footsteps echoing softly across the stone, the door closing with a sound too gentle to be final. The rain deepened as he walked home, steady, unbroken, as though the whole town were listening for a resolution that refused to come.
Evening brought with it a stillness that felt almost rehearsed.
The rain had gone, leaving the streets rinsed to silence, and the sky hung low and bruised, its last light caught in the wet leaves. Purbright walked the narrow lane toward the vicarage, his footsteps softened by the damp earth, his mind weighted by the echoes of too many polite evasions. He had sent word ahead that he might call for tea. "A matter of formality," the note had said. But formality in Flaxborough was often where truth chose to hide. The vicar answered the door himself, his face pale but determinedly courteous.
"Inspector," he said, "how good of you to come."
"Do come in out of the cold." The fire in the sitting room was modest, its warmth contained. On the small table, a tray had been set, china cups, a silver pot, and a plate of untouched biscuits. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp paper. Purbright removed his hat, brushed a droplet from the brim, and said lightly, "I hope I'm not disturbing your evening's reflection." "Not at all," the vicar replied, pouring tea with careful precision. "Though I fear reflection has become a rather crowded activity of late." Purbright accepted the cup, stirred it once, and did not drink. "I was by the river again this morning. It's dropping now. The sack has been sent to Lincoln for examination." The vicar's eyes flickered briefly toward the window. "A grim business."
"But you still think—"
"I think," Purbright interrupted softly, "that water is a poor accomplice to the truth.
It blurs everything."
Still, I found something curious in the church records. The register of choir practice, the last entry in Mr. Bream's handwriting, dated the night he vanished. The vicar's teacup halted midway to his lips. "It notes," Purbright continued, "a rehearsal at 7.
Attendance marked for all but one name, Mrs. Lovell's. She was unwell, it seems." The vicar set down his cup. "Yes, I believe she wrote to him. A small apology." "Indeed she did."
Yet the letter was not among his belongings, nor was another, one I think you found and chose not to mention. The vicar's fingers tightened on the saucer. The clock on the mantel struck the quarter hour. its chime soft but insistent. "Inspector," he said at last, "you are an uncomfortable man." Only when comfort conceals things better left said. The vicar looked down at the rug, as though reading its pattern might offer escape.
"It was a note," he said finally.
"Left in the vestry drawer."
"I destroyed it." "Destroyed it?"
It spoke of farewell.
"Of shame, not crime, you understand, but a sort of personal disgrace."
"I thought it kinder that no one should read it." Purbright's voice remained mild. Kindness and concealment are sometimes mistaken for each other. He waited. The vicar rose, paced to the window, and stood there, framed against the faint light. He wrote that he could no longer stay, that his past had returned. A woman had forgiven him once, but not twice. He said her forgiveness had become his prison. Purbright set down his cup.
"And this woman?"
"Mrs. Warden, I believe. She came to see me a month before he vanished. I told no one. She asked whether he still played with the same intensity, was her word.
I said yes."
She seemed relieved and terribly sad.
"I thought nothing of it then. You thought she'd gone?"
"Yes, but the note implied otherwise." Purbright's tone remained quiet, almost reflective. "Then he didn't leave alone?" The vicar turned sharply. "Well, what do you mean?" "He meant to go with her, I think, or to her. But something changed between intention and act."
"You destroyed the note, but you kept the silence."
"Why? For her sake," the vicar said quickly. If she had changed her mind, if she had refused him, it would have looked cruel.
"I wished to spare her the gossip." Purbright studied him for a moment, then smiled faintly. "You've succeeded admirably."
They gossip about everything else instead. The vicar's shoulders sagged. He moved to the fire and stirred it with unnecessary care. The flames hissed softly. "I thought goodness could be managed," he said. "That mercy might tidy what honesty would only tear apart." "Mercy," Purbright murmured, "is not the same as truth." "It only wears the same hat in public." The vicar gave a hollow laugh. "And now you have your truth, Inspector. A man's foolish hope and a woman's reluctance. Nothing criminal, nothing grand. Just human frailty. Very English, very dull." Purbright rose, setting his cup on the tray.
"Dull, perhaps."
"But dullness often hides the most enduring tragedies. One must listen closely to their quiet." He walked to the window. The garden lay dim under the moonlight, the path silvered with wet. If she left with him, we should have found them both. "She didn't," the vicar said quickly.
"I'm certain."
"She came again the next day. She stood at that very gate, looking toward the church, as if waiting for something she already knew would not return." "And you said nothing?" "What would I have said? That she'd been abandoned twice? That her forgiveness had cost him his peace?" Purbright turned, his expression unreadable. "You could have said goodbye." The vicar looked at him for a long time, then nodded once, a motion of defeat rather than assent. "We are poor keepers of each other, Inspector."
"Even priests." Purbright glanced at the clock.
"We are worse keepers of secrets." He moved toward the door, the quiet between them stretching thin as thread. Before stepping out, he paused. "You did the wrong thing, Vicar, but for the right reasons. That is a rarer sin than most." The vicar said nothing, only looked toward the fire where the last small flame flickered and died. Outside, the night air was cool and sharp. The rain had left behind a faint scent of earth and stone. Purbright walked slowly toward the square, his shoes striking softly on the damp pavement. The lamps burned low, their reflections shivering in puddles. Somewhere, far off, a single note sounded, perhaps the new organist testing his keys, hesitant, uncertain. Purbright paused, listening. The tone wavered, then steadied. He smiled faintly.
"In paradisum," he murmured.
Still unfinished, the sound lingered, thinned, and was gone. The town, like the vicar, held its silence once more, carefully, reverently, as if it had learned that even the gentlest truths make noise. The next morning broke with a pale, apologetic sun, as if even the sky had decided to behave again. The puddles had begun to shrink, the air smelled of laundered stone, and Flaxborough, ever efficient in matters of collective decorum, had resumed its modest rhythm. Newspapers were folded neatly, milk bottles stood like punctuation marks on doorsteps, and the disappearance of Alan Bream was, in most circles, declared sad but settled. Inspector Purbright allowed them that small comfort. He had long known that truth, when offered to the public raw, was like whiskey without water, sharp, unkind, and difficult before breakfast. He sat at his desk, the morning light pooling across his papers. In front of him lay the dried sheet music from the river, the title still legible in its ghostly script, In Paradisum. The edges had curled slightly, giving it the look of something old and tenderly kept. He smoothed it with a fingertip, then closed the folder. Sergeant Love entered, a cup of tea in hand and that careful tread of a man bringing domesticity to tragedy. "Morning, sir. I suppose we can close it, can't we?" The Lincoln police confirmed Mrs. Warden left for France a fortnight ago. No sign of foul play. Purbright looked up.
And Mr. Bream? They think he followed her.
There was a ticket bought in his name, day after she sailed. Dover line. "We'll never know if he boarded." "We rarely do," Purbright murmured. "People slip from their lives more neatly than they enter them." Love hesitated, then asked, "You'll tell the vicar?" "Yes, and the town. But gently, Sergeant. Gently." He rose, took his hat, and walked once more through Flaxborough's streets. The shopkeepers were opening shutters, children dawdled towards school, and the faint smell of bread drifted from the bakery. The townspeople had reassembled itself piece by piece, like a cautious mosaic. At the vicarage, the door was ajar. Purbright stepped inside to find the vicar arranging flowers, lilies, incongruously cheerful in their brightness. The man turned with the hesitant smile of one uncertain whether the visitor brings closure or confession. "You've come with news," he said. "With an ending," Purbright corrected, "though not the one the town will expect." He recounted the telegrams, the passage booked under Bream's name, the dates that fitted too tidily to be accident. The vicar listened in silence, one hand resting lightly on the pew rail as if to steady himself. "So he went to her," he said at last. "It seems so." "And you believe they
reconciled?"
Purbright allowed himself a small smile. If reconciliation can be defined as silence shared instead of endured, then yes.
"I think they found it." The vicar exhaled, his shoulders easing.
"Then we shall say he is safe." "Yes," Purbright said. "We shall." He left the church quietly. By noon, the story had begun to drift through Flaxborough, not as fact, not quite as rumour, but in that agreeable limbo where truth and tact meet for tea. Mr. Bream, it was said, had gone abroad for his health. Others claimed he'd joined a cathedral choir in Rouen, or perhaps retired to teach music in a convent school. Each variation gentled the unease. Each gave him, in its way, a peaceful ending. At the post office, Mrs. Pooley repeated it with satisfied gravity. "Gone to France, they say." "Well, that's something, isn't it? Better than vanishing altogether," Purbright, who happened to be posting a letter, said mildly. "Few vanish, Mrs. Pooley. They simply relocate beyond our curiosity," she nodded, not quite understanding but content to agree. "A pity, though."
"Such a talent." "Indeed," he said.
But perhaps this once he found the right audience. By late afternoon, the town had accepted the narrative fully. Conversation softened around it. Sympathy replaced speculation. Even the organ's hesitant new player found courage enough to strike a confident chord during Evensong, though it faltered halfway through Jerusalem. The congregation smiled indulgently as if the very air of St. Olaf's had decided to be kind again. Purbright lingered at the back, his hat in his hands. He felt the faintest satisfaction, not the triumph of resolution, but the relief of proportion. A man had chosen to leave, not to die. A priest had chosen silence over scandal, and a small town had chosen story over sorrow. There were, he reflected, worse settlements. As the service ended, Miss Teatime intercepted him at the door. "So," she said, "the organist lives after all."
"I should have known."
Men like that rarely vanish entirely. They merely relocate to more appreciative drawing rooms. Purbright smiled.
You think him that vain?
My dear Inspector, she said, adjusting her gloves, vanity is simply loneliness with better manners. He inclined his head. Then he had exquisite manners, she laughed, low and melodious. As do you, Inspector, which makes you equally suspicious. He offered no reply, merely stepped aside to let her pass, her perfume trailing faintly after her like punctuation. Outside, the sky was dimming toward evening. The lamps flickered to life, catching on the wet cobbles and turning them to soft gold. Purbright walked slowly toward the river, where the water moved quietly under the bridge, a dark mirror to the town above. He paused, watching the surface ripple. The current carried a stray scrap of paper, part of a hymn leaflet perhaps, its ink dissolving to nothing. The river accepted it without fuss, bearing it downstream with the indifference of time. Purbright thought of Bream then, not as a puzzle, not even as a man, but as a melody. The town had half forgotten how to hum. It was gone now, but faintly, beautifully unfinished. Behind him the church bell began to strike 6, the sound round and slow, echoing across the damp air. He turned for home, his coat brushing against the low hedge, footsteps soft on the wet road. Flaxborough had regained its balance. That peculiar English order in which sorrow must never be too loud, nor truth too sharp. In the space where the scandal might have lived, there was now only gentleness, and a faint note of irony, which Purbright found almost comforting. He reached his gate as the final chime faded. The air smelled faintly of rain and coal smoke. Somewhere far off, a piano sounded from an open window, a slow, careful rendition of Abide With Me. Purbright paused, listening until the tune faltered, then continued softly on its way. Yes, he murmured, almost to himself. That will do. The sound drifted after him as he closed the door, a lingering grace note in the polite quiet of evening. Sunday morning returned with its usual dutiful calm. The streets were washed clean by an overnight drizzle, the air sharp with coal smoke and the faint sweetness of baking bread. Church bells rose through the mist, slow and deliberate, calling Flaxborough back to its habits. Windows brightened, curtains stirred, and the town resumed its careful, collective breathing. Inside St. Olaf's, the pews filled gradually. Coats were shaken free of damp, hymnals opened with polite rustles. The congregation moved like clockwork, settling into its familiar choreography of bows, nods, and murmured greetings. A sense of polite restoration hung about the place, one that Purbright, seated quietly near the back, found both reassuring and faintly comic. The new organist, a thin, earnest man from Lincoln, took his place with visible nerves. His hands hovered over the keys like someone uncertain of permission. Then, with a small, determined breath, he began. The notes emerged carefully, hesitant at first, then gathering courage, filling the nave with an unsteady warmth. It was in Paradisum. Purbright smiled, almost imperceptibly. The irony was gentle, perhaps unintentional, but perfect nonetheless. The tune trembled, searching for its balance, the melody not quite confident, yet unwilling to fail. It sounded less like mourning now and more like remembering. He let his gaze drift across the rows of bowed heads. Mrs. Larch, demure in her hat of morning grey, sat very still. Mrs. Lovell sang with quiet fervour, eyes glistening in the candlelight. Miss Teatime mouthed the words without sound, her expression that of someone watching a play she'd already solved. Even the vicar seemed lighter, his voice steady as he read the lesson. There was no mention of the organist, nor of loss, nor of letters, but his tone carried the faint resonance of understanding. The service moved as it always did. Prayers, hymn, sermon, collection. Routine as comfort, tradition as remedy. And yet, Purbright thought, beneath the order there lingered a small, delicate melancholy, as if every soul present had agreed wordlessly to remember and to forgive without naming either act. When the final blessing came, the congregation rose in near-perfect unison. The organist closed with a modest flourish, a single confident chord that hung in the air longer than intended, then faded into silence. There was a moment's pause, too brief for awkwardness, long enough for grace, before the scraping of pews resumed and the parishioners filed out into the soft light. Outside, the air was cool, touched with the scent of damp earth and candle wax. Voices drifted low and amiable. Someone remarked that the new organist wasn't quite the same, but perhaps that's for the best. Someone else replied that Mr. Bream would have approved. Neither statement was true, yet both served their purpose. Purbright stood for a while at the edge of the churchyard, watching the slow procession disperse along the lane. He nodded to Mrs. Larch, exchanged a few benign words with the vicar, and listened with the faintest amusement to Miss Teatime declaring that she found in Paradisum rather cheerful under the circumstances. When they were gone, he walked the path that wound past the graves and toward the bridge. The river had subsided, its surface smooth now, reflecting the pewter light of morning. The reeds swayed softly, their motion gentle, untroubled. The spot where the sack had once lodged showed no sign of disturbance. Time had already folded over it. He paused midway across the bridge, resting a hand on the cold stone. Below, the water moved at its quiet pace, carrying fragments of leaves and the faint memory of rain. The world, he thought, was efficient in its forgetting. Yet it was not the vanishing that lingered. It was the residue of presence, the marks left by what refused to stay gone. Behind him, the bells began again, slower now, marking the hour. The sound moved through the mist like breath. He thought of Bream, not as a case, nor a curiosity, but as a man who had lived between music and silence, never entirely comfortable in either. Pride and tenderness, regret and escape, all had played their part in his small, intricate fugue. A departure, yes, but not disappearance. Purbright smiled faintly, the kind that never quite reached the eyes. "It isn't where one goes," he murmured, "but what one leaves in the echo." He turned back toward town, his footsteps soft on the damp path. The lamps, though unlit, still gleamed faintly from the rain. Somewhere, a door shut gently, a dog barked once, and the sound of a kettle lid rattling carried faintly from a kitchen window. Life, precise and domestic, had resumed its melody. As he neared the square, the faintest trace of the organ reached his ears again. A tentative phrase, repeated, corrected, then played with conviction. The new man was practicing still, shaping the air as though coaxing something from it. Purbright walked on, the sound following him until it thinned into distance. Flaxborough stood, as it always had, small, mannerly, faintly absurd, and entirely itself. Its secrets, like its virtues, were carefully kept, not out of deceit, but from the understanding that some truths are better lived with quietly than shouted into daylight. He reached his doorstep, paused to wipe the faintest trace of mud from his shoes, and glanced once more toward the church spire, just visible through the thinning mist. The bells had stopped now. The town, satisfied, had resumed its gentle hum. Purbright opened the door, the latch clicking softly behind him. In the hush that followed, the faint rhythm of rain returned against the window panes, steady, soothing, and familiar, like the last bar of a long, unhurried hymn. Thanks for watching the video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The end.